In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 14, in which we go over regulation, where in the last video we saw how the presence of external costs leads to market failure. Now we seek to use that information in order to discuss regulation options, where we will do so by setting up some preliminaries in order to go over market-based options, proceed on to command and control-based options, and conclude with the optimal rate of pollution. Where, beginning with our preliminaries, using the example of a firm's production process leading to pollution in the form of a waste product, we saw that if neither firms nor consumers take into account the cost of the waste product from production, then a third party will. If a third party is affected by a market of consumers and firms, then external costs exist. If external costs exist, then market failure exists in that market, even if we assume a perfectly competitive market structure, since the cost of the waste product is not being realized by the firm. So firm costs go understated, such that marginal cost is understated. The result then is that true marginal cost pricing goes unrealized, where this then leads to an equilibrium for the firm in which there's optimal pricing, but too much output given that perfectly competitive market structure. So then, given this form of market failure due to external costs, we now seek to see how the government can intervene in such markets, where the two strategies available to the government will be in the form of market-based options and command and control-based options, where, beginning with our market-based options, these will alter market incentives such that they discourage pollution, where this focuses on eliminating external costs so that we have social costs equaling private costs, where, recalling our formula for external costs, this means external cost is equal to the difference between social and private costs. Should there be no external costs, this translates to our social costs being equal to our private costs, which as a result implies that costs from waste products are being internalized by some combination of the consumers or firms in the market. If we focus our attention in terms of the firms internalizing these costs, we can look at this graphically, where here we're assuming a perfectly competitive market structure, and we're looking at the profit maximization process for a competitive firm, where price is going to be on the vertical axis, quantity of output is on the horizontal axis. We have our horizontal marginal revenue curve, we have our upward sloping marginal cost curve, and our U-shaped average total cost curve as well. It's U-shaped in that it's downward sloping when average fixed cost is dominant and upward sloping when average variable costs are dominant. And in regards to this average total cost structure and this marginal cost structure, here we're assuming that only private costs are being realized. That is, the cost of the waste product is going unrealized by the firm and is affecting some third party. So in regards to the profit maximization process, the firm will maximize profits when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, corresponding to point A, giving us our equilibrium output level of 1,000, and our corresponding price point as well. If we go through with some of our market-based options, such that the firm internalizes these costs of the waste product when they're producing their good or service, this will translate into an increase in their cost structure, which will push up their average total cost curve. So we'll see an upward shift from ATC1 to ATC2, and we'll have a change in our marginal cost structure in which we'll consider marginal cost 2. So this higher cost structure translates into a leftward shift in the marginal cost curve. So then, in terms of our profit maximization process, considering the marginal cost curve and average total cost curve, when the firm realizes societal's costs, we have marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost 2, giving us our bundle at point B, in which we have our optimal level of pricing as before, and we now have our new equilibrium level of output, where we see we have a reduced level of output, as we saw in our prior video as well. So then, in regards to how the firm can internalize the cost of the waste product, this can be done so through a variety of means, where such methods include emission charges, recycling, higher user fees, green taxes, pollution fines, as well as tradable pollution permits, where some of these options will also transfer the costs over to consumers, in which consumers also internalize some of the cost of the waste product. So, looking at these individually, in regards to emission charges, these are going to be fees imposed on polluters based on the quantity of pollution, where this will increase the marginal cost structure for the firm and bring us closer to the societal marginal cost curve. And this will then lead to less output and the use of cleaner production technology as a result. In regards to recycling, this is going to be an alternative to sending packaging to the landfill and turning materials into new products. However, the thing to keep in mind with recycling is there's no incentive for a firm to pursue this option unless it is cheaper to do so from a production standpoint. Now moving on to our third option in regards to higher user fees, this is going to be an increase on the price point on resources used, which effectively transfers the cost to consumers, in which they face a higher price point due to the cost of this waste product, where such an example will be an increase in the price of gas. This will have the effect of fewer cars being driven on the road, which will then translate to less auto emissions as a result, reducing pollution. Now, moving on to our fourth option, we have green taxes, which is going to be the government taxing activities that cause pollution, where the tax could be imposed on both consumers or firms, where such examples include a tax on gasoline, which would be a higher price point for consumers to bear, and would be analogous to our third option, in which there's higher user fees. Additionally, we could also have a tax on plant emissions, which would translate to higher costs that a firm would bear, which would then push up their average total cost curve and would shift their marginal cost curve to the left, moving it closer to the societal marginal cost structure. Now, moving on to pollution fines, the government can impose a fine on polluting and impose liability for cleanup costs as well, given that if a significant polluting event occurs, then the party responsible must pay for it, where an example of this would be oil spills, where the BP oil spill from the early 2000s comes to mind. And in regards to this pollution fine, this incentivizes firms to be cautious to avoid such events and having to pay for cleaning up for such events. Now, lastly, we have tradable pollution permits, in which a market is set up where low polluters will have unused pollution permits that they can sell to high polluters. This allows for our twin forces of supply and demand to determine the price of pollution permits, and this will incentivize firms to be low polluters such that they can sell their unused pollution permits and generate further profits. So then, with all these options considered, all of the latter options provide incentives to modify the firm's production process or their use of inputs, where, given these options and firms being profit maximizers, firms will continue to then try to minimize their costs, which would also entail in reducing pollution, where overall, this then would have the process be driven by technological innovation. So then, with our market-based options considered, let us now move to our command and control-based options, which are going to be government regulations that force firm compliance in terms of internalizing waste product costs, where the upside to this is going to be that firms must comply with the government regulations or face penalties and fines, similar to what we saw with our taxes and our pollution fines in the market-based options. However, the downsides will be firms have no incentives to innovate and instead just follow the government regulations. Additionally, these regulations are usually rather rigid and do not react to market changes or technological changes that occur. So as a result, this could then lead to government failure as a consequence, in which the market is worse off than had the government never intervened in the first place. So then, with our market-based options and command and control-based options considered, we now move on to the optimal rate of pollution, where, given our two approaches of internalizing external costs, what should be done? Well, our approach should strive for a cleaner environment, as well as a market in which market failure does not occur due to external costs. However, like all of our choices, we will be limited by our resources. There are costs to consumers, firms, and or the government for given internalization of the costs of waste products. Thus, we need to compare the marginal benefit, that is, the cleaner environment, and the closer we are to removing market failure, to the additional costs incurred. That is, how does an additional dollar in cost compare to the additional benefit of a cleaner environment and a market closer to an efficient outcome? As with our prior analysis in terms of comparing marginal benefit to marginal cost, the optimal rate is when the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost, and this is going to determine our optimal rate of pollution, where in regards to this optimal rate of pollution, as mentioned, this occurs when the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost, and this will be at a non-zero rate of pollution in which it'll make use of cost internalization to some degree, which means higher production costs to firms, such that they move closer to the societal marginal cost structure. But this also means higher price points for consumers, in which some of the cost of the waste product gets bared by consumers. And since the government has intervened, that means they're using some of their resources in terms of this intervention, where those resources used can't be used in other markets for intervention processes as well. And lastly, in regards to the market in question that we're looking at, this corresponds to a reduced amount of output in equilibrium, where with a reduced amount of output, this means less production. Less production means less labor resources used. With less labor resources used, this means less employment as well.